Hi, I'm Conrad Marshall, and from the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age, welcome to Good Weekend Talks, a magazine for your ears featuring in-depth conversations with fascinating people from sport and politics, science and culture, business and beyond. Every week you can download new episodes in which top journalists from across our newsrooms talk to compelling people about the definitive stories of the day. In this episode, we talk to Hugh de Kretser. The President of the Australian Human Rights Commission has quite the job. Never has society been more polarised, with distressing displays of religious and ethnic hatred bursting onto our streets, while at the very same time, the relevance of the Commission itself has been called into question. De Kretser, who gave up a promising corporate legal career to work in community law, is up for the challenge of defending the institution. But he's also got to protect the rights of the people caught up in the most contentious conflict of our time, the war in the Middle East, and how it affects communities in Australia. He's the topic of our cover story this week, Man in the Middle, and hosting our conversation today is the writer of that profile, James Button.
Thanks, Conrad, and welcome, Hugh.
Thanks for having me.
It's another conversation we're having. We've had quite a few, haven't we, in the last 6 months?
We have. It's been good.
It's been great. We've talked about human rights. We've talked about Australian politics, about your life. And I might start there, Hugh.
Yep.
Tell us a bit about yourself. Who are you and how did you get into the human rights world?
So I was born in Melbourne to a very happy, stable, loving family, a privileged family. My dad was a Sri Lankan migrant, came to Australia in 1949. He's from a small part of the Sri Lankan community called the Dutch Burghers, who are the descendants of Dutch and Portuguese colonists in Sri Lanka. It was the British who took over and let them stay, and they intermarried with Sinhalese and Tamil and formed a Eurasian race. So a very interesting part of world history and a real melting pot. And so the Dutch Burghers were Christian, spoke English, some had very fair skin, some had very dark skin. And so Dad's family emigrated to Australia during the White Australia policy in 1949 and managed to dodge the racial boundaries by pointing to their European heritage. And Mum's side of the family is Anglo-Irish. I think the earliest descendant was Irish in about the 1840s. When I was at the Yoorrook Justice Commission, I got into this a bit and looking back at it. And so they met and married, had 4 boys, lived in the sort of outer, near Monash University in Clayton South, and then moved to Surrey Hills where I grew up. And had a privileged upbringing. And then myself, I'm married, got 2 kids and a dog. Tell
us about the dog. The dog's got an interesting name. Well, not the name, but the history.
Yeah, the dog's called Taco, and Taco was born in Broken Hill. I think the male dog got into the female dog enclosure at a farm and had 10 or 11 pups, and then they had a farm in Benalla as well. We somehow knew someone who knew them, and as we were leaving, we said, when was the dog's birthday? And they said, 10th of December. And I'm like, International Human Rights Day, which is also my daughter's birthday as well.
Amazing.
So, yes.
And I think that's the first thing you told me when we first met, and I thought, gee, this guy really does care about human rights.
I do.
So you had this privileged upbringing. Just before we leave your family, just say a bit more about your dad, because obviously that interesting migration story, he went on to become, he was a very well-known endocrinologist, I believe.
Yeah.
And then he went on to become Governor of Victoria. So give us a sense of his life arc.
Sure. So he was about 9 years old when he moved to Australia. He studied medicine, decided that research was his passion, got into reproductive health medicine, endocrinology, male infertility, worked on IVF, worked on the male pill, was an idea that never really took off, but was always got a few headlines. And he met my mum, and I sort of asked Mum, what was it like dating a Sri Lankan boy? And
in an older Australia, right?
In very, 1950s, 1960s Australia, white Australia. And, she said her mum, my grandmother, when I think they were dating, warned about the risk of throwbacks. This is, for those who don't know, throwbacks, this is the idea that, that you will have a black child or a dark-skinned child, and that's a bad thing.
And has it shaped you at all, Hugh, that coming from on one side of your family, a migrant, non-white family, has that shaped your thinking?
Yeah, for sure. I think it's a gift for the kind of work that I do. It's sort of, growing up mixed race. I thought about it a lot when we're doing Aboriginal justice issues and looking at the way law tried to categorise race. It's impossible. Race is a social construct, and you're trying to impose laws and rules around it. And for me, growing up mixed race, I always felt different from the mainstream is how I'd describe it. And you don't know this until you get older. And so, I had lots of conversations with my colleague at the Commission, Giri Sivaraman, about race and growing up outside of the mainstream. And for me, it was difficult because some people, look at me and think, oh, you're European, or some people think you're Australian. I get mistaken for everything, basically. So, but yeah, that's a gift for the kind of work that I do because, I've had some experience of sitting on the outside, and you and I talked about this in one of our conversations. I didn't really experience racism when I was a kid, felt very different, but, I remember traveling overseas and in Europe, and there were particular times when, there was one in particular I remember when police got on a train. I was with three very fair-skinned friends from Australia. We were backpacking, and the police got on a carriage. There were maybe 20 people in the carriage. They asked for one person's passport, and that was mine.
Yeah, interesting. So you've had this privileged upbringing. You're quite upfront about that. Private school, did a very good degree at Melbourne University, went to the United Nations on a prized internship. Tell us about your first human rights job. You probably didn't think of it in those terms initially, but you started as a corporate lawyer.
Yep.
But then something happened in your life. Take us through that moment and that change for you.
Yeah, sort of looking at what to do for your career as you do. I wanted to be a journalist originally. I've studied law and arts and loved the study of law. There's lots of lawyers who don't like being a lawyer. I'm not one of those. I love being a lawyer, and I love the idea of the law and how it can create a better society, and that's been a passion of mine. I did that time at the UN, which was an incredible time of my life, but also taught me that I didn't want to be a diplomat. And had the opportunity to be trained in one of the top corporate law firms. So I did that and got excellent training. I've had a long, good relationship with that firm. They continued to, I've worked with them over the past sort of 20, 25 years. But that's never where I wanted to be long term. And so I was looking for other opportunities. I was doing some pro bono work, which is work that lawyers do for free for people who can't afford a lawyer. I was doing some volunteering in human rights organisations at a community legal centre, and the opportunity came up to the Attorney General in Victoria at the time, Rob Hulls, had set up a scheme where big law firms loaned lawyers for free to community legal centres, and I put my hand up. I learnt more in those first 6 months at that community legal service, a 6-month secondment, about justice and human rights and the law than I had in all of my legal training in the sort of 4.5 years I've been working in corporate law at Mallison's. And
that, Hugh, if I can just butt in there, it's because you were dealing with people who were really up against it, weren't they? People who'd been prisoners who families of prisoners who had died in custody, people who had been bashed by police, all sorts of very...
people who, women who had experienced childhood sexual assault, people who are deeply mentally unwell, people who were poor and being chased by debt collectors.
So what was it that... I've always, when I'm in these interviews with you, I've really wanted to understand, what was it about those experiences, those encounters with people really in tough circumstances that shifted things for you?
Well, I was fortunate to work in that community legal centre. Amanda George was a fantastic advocate. She taught me a lot about community development, social justice, about media and how laws are like lawyers, the law schools are teaching people about what the law is and theories about the law, and not enough about how laws are made and how laws are changed. And she was she understood that well and sort of introduced me to law reform. And one of my colleagues there was an advocate called Charandev Singh, who was brilliant paralegal. No, doesn't have a law degree, but knows more about death and custody law than probably anyone in the country. And so I remember he invited me to his house. We were doing some cases together, deaths in custody and assaults in prison. And he gave me a talking to, and basically over a cup of tea and Reservoir said, you need to use your privilege for good. And for me, that really resonated with me, and I have thought a lot about it over the years. Some people are driven to pursue a career in human rights because of religion, because of politics, or because of personal, lived experience of human rights abuses. We talked about mixed race background. That was probably part of the picture. I was raised, our best family friends were from South Africa, white South Africans who were involved in progressive anti-apartheid politics there. So I had that upbringing and that understanding that probably influenced me. But for me, what really resonated was, that idea of using these skills I had, which I'd been applying in a corporate law context for companies that could afford the best lawyers money could buy. I worked hard in corporate law. I worked much harder in community law and got a lot out of it and learnt a lot and felt a sense of purpose, if you like, to do that and to help people. And it was frustrating and challenging. I went from winning most of the cases to losing most. It was much harder to get justice.
For sure.
It was very rewarding. And then after a time, I got sick of seeing people experience injustice in a system that because laws weren't drafted properly, because policies weren't applied, because practices were being done in an unjust way. And because of that work with Amanda and others, I got involved in law reform and policy work, and that's become a passion of mine.
And then you rose from there to head the Federation of Community Legal Centres in Victoria. You ran the Human Rights Law Centre, and then you shifted a little bit sideways and took a job at the Yoorrook Justice Commission.
Yeah.
And you had a deep personal experience at Yoorrook, didn't you? You've described it in the article as the hardest job you've ever done and the most rewarding. What was that personal connection for you?
Yeah, I loved my colleagues. Arnie Eleanor Burke was the chair, incredible Aboriginal leader. Like, she's seen so much in her life, and I learned so much, incredible strength. I've done lots of Aboriginal justice work before then. Where I grew up in Surrey Hills, there were no Aboriginal people or visible Aboriginal people or people that I knew were Aboriginal. There were huge missed opportunities in my education to better educate me and people like me about Aboriginal history and culture and strength and resilience and injustice and how to fix it. I worked on Aboriginal justice issues at Human Rights Law Centre and Federation, but I have described it as knowing them intellectually, but not in my heart. And the work at Yoorrook gave me a much deeper understanding. That it was led by 4 Aboriginal commissioners. Half of the barrister team were Aboriginal. At its top, almost half of the staff were First Nations. 60% of the executive team First Nations, and so. It was an absolute privilege going to work and working in that environment, and most Australians don't get that opportunity. And so I learnt I just described it as putting on a different pair of glasses. Like, it changed my worldview, and I see Australia very, very differently because of that experience.
And now you've gone in 2024. You moved from the Yoorrook Justice Commission to take what is the highest human rights job in the country, the president of the Australian Human Rights Commission.
Yeah.
Before we get to the commission, though, I think
probably
we should...
the Prime Minister's probably the highest human rights job in the country. But,
Good point.
That's most formal, highest formal human rights job in the country.
Well said. Give us, before we get to the commission, though, let's talk about the term human rights. It's a term that I've always struggled with a bit, because on one level, we're all for human rights, aren't we? What does human rights mean to you, Hugh? what is that term? You've said a number. You say it all the time. I'm passionate about human rights.
Yeah.
What does the term mean to you, and how do we make it a term that's meaningful and not just a kind of expression of sort of motherhood statements of treating each other well?
Yeah, well, I want people to have a good life. I want people to be able to live well. There is so much injustice on this planet, and what happened after World War II was the world got together and said, how do we make sure this never happens again? Of course, it has happened, and conflict and violence is still happening. Human rights abuses is still happening. But they came up with a document, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which I firmly believe is one of the greatest achievements in human history. And what they did was say, what are the essential ingredients that we all need to lead a decent, dignified, safe life? And they listed 30 rights and governments around the world. It was adopted by the UN General Assembly in 1948, and Australian was president of the UN General Assembly, 10th of December, Taco's birthday.
And that Australian was?
And Doc Evatt,
Yep.
So really
became
great.
A Labor leader.
Deputy Prime Minister, I think, and I know him more for his contributions to the international human rights. I was at an event last night celebrating 80 years of the UN. Australia played an absolute critical role in setting up the UN during World War II. We were one of the first signatories to the UN Declaration, helped to draft the UN Charter, one of 8 or 9 drafters for the Universal Declaration, led by Eleanor Roosevelt, with representatives from all around the world. And we're a strong supporter of the Universal Declaration. And Doc Evatt was arguing for it to go further, said there should be stronger enforcement powers, said there should be an international human rights court. Was a very strong voice, bringing smaller middle nations together to say this is important if we want prosperity, security, stability, peace in the world. These are the things that we need to uphold as nations.
In the article that I've written for Good Weekend, I advance an argument that human rights after World War II was not designed to lean left or right. It was designed to be a set of principles that all people could embrace.
Yep.
But over time, the changes in the political landscape have seen human rights come to be embraced more as a left-wing issue than as a conservative or right-wing issue. And I'm going to ask.
I'm not sure I agree with that.
Yeah, no, that's what I'm going to.
Yeah.
I want to hear your response to that.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on that?
You can look at Churchill, great conservative leader.
Churchill's back in the post-war period.
Sure, but he was one of the greatest proponents for the European Convention on Human Rights. You can fast forward to so after the Universal Declaration, the 2 key treaties were the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. So for reasons of the Cold War, they split it into civil and political and economic and social, unhelpfully. I wish that hadn't happened. It was successive governments, Labor and then Liberal, who signed and ratified those 2 treaties, Whitlam and then Fraser. There is bipartisan support for the Universal Declaration and all the key human rights treaties. And so for me, if you look at something like the citizenship booklet, so take the Howard government. So they said, we're going to define what it means to be Australian, if you like. And they came up with this idea of the citizenship booklet. It was controversial for some reasons. I've been thinking a lot in this job and previously about what it means to be Australian. What do we stand for as a nation? And I went back to the citizenship booklet and, do we stand as a British or Irish identity? Do we stand as an Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander identity? Do we stand as a multicultural nation? So you can see the sort of changing identity over time. What the citizenship booklet does when it seeks to define Australian values, it defines them in terms that are human rights terms. equal opportunity, fairness, freedom of religion, freedom of association, freedom of speech. If you look at the Liberal Party constitution, it might be described as a human rights lawyer's dream. It talks about, civil and political rights, much more so than economic and social rights.
So by civil and political rights, tell us what you mean. That's freedom of speech.
So, thanks. Freedom of speech, right to vote,
religious expression,
freedom of religion, freedom from arbitrary detention, not to be locked up unfairly, safety, liberty, and security of person. And so economic, social rights, these are the ones that, by the way, when you ask Australians what are human rights, and they tend to jump to health, housing, education, food, water, things like that. So this unhelpful divide, because of Cold War historic reasons, they're all human rights. They're all in the Universal Declaration in 1948. But there tends to be, one party will talk more about one side of rights and maybe the other. But it's in our national interest, regardless of politics, to support this, because you look at how do we promote a rules-based world order, and why do we promote that? It's because in 1948, the world got together, or 45, with the UN Charter, and said, if we want to say never again to war and conflict, hasn't succeeded, but it's diminished over time, and human rights movement has had huge positive benefits, some failures over time. The keys to international peace, security, prosperity, stability, human rights. And if we look at how we have stronger, healthier, safer, more prosperous communities, human rights. And so, human rights should absolutely transcend politics, and there should be a common national interest in stronger support for these standards and application of the principles.
So let's come to the Commission. The Australian Human Rights Commission, established permanently in 1986, first established, as you say, under a coalition government in 1981 on a temporary basis.
Yep.
From 1986.
A Fraser government set us up. Hawke government made us permanent.
That's right. So very much honouring Australia's requirements under one of those treaties set out in the 1966 treaties to deliver human rights in Australia. But the Commission has changed over time, hasn't it? And the Commission's focus, obviously not all the Commission, but it seems to me that the Commission has focused more in recent years on issues of particular interest to the left side of politics, issues around identity.
I don't agree, but
no. And I'm going to ask for your response in a second. Issues around race. What are your? Do you disagree? And tell me why you disagree.
Yeah, you can take the Respect at Work agenda. So this is work led by former Sex Discrimination Commissioner Kate Jenkins, and off the back of work the Commission has done for about 20 years, measuring the prevalence of sexual harassment, and I think people understand, and particularly women understand, it is extremely widespread. 1 in 3 workers in the last 5 years report experiencing sexual harassment. So Kate Jenkins and the Commission led work around what to do about that. And those recommendations were implemented firstly by the Morrison government and then by the Albanese government. Every single one of those recommendations has been implemented. You can go back over time to the probably our most prominent or well-recognised work was the Bringing Them Home report. So this is a report that built on the incredible advocacy and strength of survivors of the stolen generations. Policies that removed children unjustly from families and communities and placed them with non-Aboriginal families as part of an explicit elimination assimilation agenda, which changed over time. The Commission documented that and made recommendations to reform that. And I think the report was initially opposed by the Howard government. And that report and that advocacy by survivors and then amplified by the Commission led to the apology to the stolen generations by Prime Minister Kevin Rudd. And then you can fast forward to, I think it was 2020, 2020, 2021, and the Morrison government implemented a key recommendation to have a redress scheme, compensation scheme for people who had suffered injustice as a result of these policies. So this is law reform, right? This is what I was talking about. What is it that creates the conditions that means that something that's rejected one year might be implemented by another government, 5 or 10 years later? And yes, that might be rejected by one side of politics and implemented by another. It might be the other way around. But I would argue that what we need to do is build a stronger understanding in Australia of why we have these human rights principles, why everyone benefits when we have human rights protected and upheld. And what we've seen over time is that there's certain communities who experience human rights abuse. If you're First Nations community, you understand they're far more educated about their human rights than I ever was as a child, because I didn't have the lived experience of being close to child removal or criminal justice policies or economic disadvantage. You look at the Jewish community. I've done a lot of work with the Jewish community over the years through philanthropy and otherwise, and they have an acute experience of the Holocaust and prejudice since then. So Muslim community, we can talk more about this, but particulars community, LGBTI community, marriage equality, these are communities who have experienced acute injustice, understand the importance of human rights. What we need to do is broaden that understanding to say for people who might have not had to think, we're lucky in Australia. We have a strong, prosperous, relatively very successful democracy on a world standard. And that means there can be this complacency around human rights. And it's fascinating for me during COVID that what you saw was people who have never thought about their human rights are suddenly saying, what gives the government the right to tell me that I can't move 5K from my home, or that I can't work, or I can't run my business, or I can't leave the country, or I can't return to the country if I'm a citizen? So we saw an uptick and a greater awareness of human rights and the need for stronger human rights principles during COVID.
The Commission's done a report recently on the COVID experience of COVID. And I think what's interesting about COVID, you've just mentioned it, is, as you said, it's one of the first times that across the Australian society, people would be aware of human rights issues and potential breaches.
Yeah.
But let's focus, you mentioned the Jewish community and Muslim community. So let's go to the most contentious issue of our time. You and I spent a lot of time discussing this. So we have the impact of the Hamas attack and then the subsequent war in Gaza playing out in Australia. Tell me about how does the Commission's been criticised, I think probably most prominently by the Jewish community, they have criticised the Commission for not standing up enough for the Jewish community when they have experienced anti-Semitism in Australia. But tell me your thoughts about how the Commission plays a role in this extremely contentious conflict domestically. What is the role of the Commission? How can it be seen as a trusted interpreter and respondent to all communities involved in this conflict?
We've got feedback from lots of communities about things we need to do better. So not just the Jewish community, the Palestinian community would say, there's been media about this saying that we're not doing enough to speak out about the injustice in Gaza and Palestine and the impact on Palestinian, Muslim, Arab communities in Australia. Jewish community saying you're not doing enough to stand up about anti-Semitism and anti-Israeli sentiment as well. So
can I interrupt you there for a second and say, this is an important point. You mentioned injustice in Palestine and Gaza.
Yeah.
What is the role of the Commission there? Is the Commission charged with speaking out on international issues, or is it really should be focused on human rights?
Yeah, this is important to understand. So we are an Australian government independent statutory agency. Our job is set out by our legislation, and that is strongly focused on Australia. So and the actions of the Australian government. So we don't have a role in judging or commenting on international events and human rights abuses overseas. We are part of a network of national human rights institutions discrimination. So we are sort of allied to the UN system, if you like. There's about 120 national human rights institutions globally, and we collaborate on shared goals with them. But yeah, our primary focus is on Australia. And I should have said our primary focus is on discrimination law complaints. So we receive and investigate and conciliate about 3,000 complaints of discrimination every year. Race, sex, age, disability. Disability is the number one, and we seek to find common ground to conciliate them. And if it can't be settled, then people can take that to court.
So let's just stay on the Israel-Palestine issue, if we can, for a bit longer.
Yeah. So our primary role is race discrimination. So we are receiving and investigating and conciliating complaints around race hate speech and racial discrimination. And so that's our primary access to justice role, if you like. And you know, those are all confidential, but some of these, where there's a settlement and people talk about their settlement and their process through the Australian Human Rights Commission. Some of them can't be settled and some of them go to court. So there's been a recent example where Peter Wertheim from the Executive Council of Australian Jury brought a successful case under Section 18C of the Racial Discrimination Act for race hate speech by an Islamic preacher. And so there's a primary role in terms of access to justice, and then there's a role in terms of better laws, policies, and practices, and promoting understanding and acceptance of human rights in Australia. And we're running a prevalence survey around racism at universities. This is not just anti-Palestinian or anti-Semitism. It's racism, First Nations, international students from a range of backgrounds, anti-Asian sentiment, but obviously in universities in Australia, the impact of the war in the Middle East has been acute in terms of the distress felt by and anti-Semitism experienced by Jewish students, and also for those who are speaking up about the injustice happening in Palestine, their experiences that they feel that they're being silenced and mistreated because of their advocacy. And so the Commission is doing this national prevalence survey, but more than that, we'll be making recommendations to help address and to help universities to make the right decisions about how to respond to this, and and the most acute area is where the balance is between protest rights and freedom of expression, and the rights of people to safety, and the rights of people to be free from discrimination and hate speech.
It's extremely sensitive, isn't it? Because the 5A Alliance, which is a alliance of academics, has recently published a report with a lot of kind of narrative stories in it about the experience of Jewish students. And those students who are alleging having experienced anti-Semitism, when asked where is that anti-Semitism coming from, they've alleged it's coming more from the left side of politics than from the right side of politics. And so those people on the left who are supporting the Palestinian cause would often, the idea that they are racist, they call themselves anti-racists. So my question is, if you have this, Jewish students saying they're having this experience, and they are saying it's coming more from the left of politics, how does the Racism at Uni report that the Commission is working on, I know it's not out yet, it's coming out in October, but how does it address that question in a way that isn't just saying one group says they've experienced racism, another group says they've experienced racism? That's what the interim report does, and of course it's just an interim report.
Yep.
So how do you find some way of making, building some, is it possible even to find some way of building some sense of the rights and responsibilities? I mean, we're talking about students here, students who go to university to learn, to hear other points of view, who we hope are not, on any side voicing, racism or hate. How do we get all those students to, and is this a role of the Racism at Uni report, to build common ground? Because you talk a lot about this, Hugh.
Yep.
And I'm just wondering if there's a role for the Commission and a role for this particular report.
we have an allied project called Seen and Heard, and those words are chosen very carefully because part of the answer is seeing and hearing and listening and acknowledging and talking about those experiences goes some of the way, because the different communities affected by the war in the Middle East are saying people don't understand, people don't hear, people don't understand that if I'm a Jewish student or if I'm the parent of a Jewish student, I don't feel safe on campus. I'm not turning up to lectures. When I lodge a complaint, I don't have faith in the complaint process that it's going to be fair. Why am I being told to stay away from campus when instead of the university addressing the cause that I feel unsafe? Why I don't feel safe wearing a kippah or a Star of David? Students from Muslim and Palestinian backgrounds are saying we can't speak up about the injustice. Our free speech rights are being denied. We're not able to protest. We're suffering reprisals when we do speak up. And so part of the project is about acknowledging those experiences and talking about them and recognizing them. But we need to do more than that. And the Commission, I think, is the best placed organisation in the country to do this, to actually make practical this hard. Some of it's easy, by the way. Hate speech. There's the firebombing of a synagogue. That's horrific. No one's arguing that should be tolerated. There needs to be a hard criminal justice response on that, and then we can have a debate about protest laws and things like that. The hardest issues are the ones where you have the intersecting laws and responsibilities around freedom of speech, freedom of political opinion, freedom from discrimination, freedom from hate speech, workplace health and safety laws. So a university administrator is looking at this. You've got arts organisations, philanthropic organisations, social justice organisations. All of them are navigating this landscape right now. Some of it's playing out in court, the Lattouf case, ABC and Lattouf. Some of it's playing out in court in the race hate speeches. We want to try and prevent that, to say, how can we create the best environment possible that respects people's rights to speak up about injustice, while doing so in a way that also respects people's rights to be safe when they're accessing their right to an education as well, talking in the university setting. But this plays out across society.
So the Siegel report that came out this week mentions universities. What are your thoughts as President of the Human Rights Commission about... Now, the Siegel report is the report from the Special Envoy, into anti-Semitism, Gillian Siegel. She's produced a report. It's gone to government and was launched this week by the Prime Minister and her. What are your thoughts about the recommendations?
So I haven't read the report. Probably it just came out yesterday afternoon, I think. But I've read the media about the report, and it'll be an important contribution to the debate. And what struck me when I looked at the media reporting on her report was a lot of what she's saying is what we've said under the National Anti-Racism Framework, which we released last year. So we released, after years of consultation, a broad-based National Anti-Racism Framework, ambitious in scope, to say, how do we eliminate racism in this country? And there's recommendations around media, education, law, regulation, etc. And when I looked at Gillian Siegel's report, she's talking about education about anti-Semitism. Furiously agree. There is a lack of understanding about the impact of anti-Semitism, about the history of the Holocaust, the long and enduring hatred towards Jews that goes back a long time and that is manifesting now, and often manifests when there's social unrest and Jews get blamed for particular things that are happening. Completely agree. She talks about the sewer of online hatred and how to get better regulation when there's limits to what an Australian government can do for overseas tech companies. Furiously agree about that. We need much better regulation online, not just to regulate anti-Semitism, but to regulate all forms of racist hate speech online.
Sorry to interrupt you, but in a way, the hard bit about the Siegel, and it goes to the anti-racism framework. I mean, both the anti-racism framework and the Siegel report talk about regulating media. Yep. And Siegel goes further and says universities should be defunded if they don't these are very sweeping recommendations, both the Siegel report and the National Anti-Racism Framework, calling on media to be regulated. How do you do that? And isn't it that we've got to change minds, don't we? Like, is regulation the answer, either on racism or on anti-Semitism?
It depends. It's part of the answer often, but it's by no means the sole answer. And so we released work with Media Diversity Australia to say how can we get better reporting on race? How can we get more diverse newsrooms? What's the experience for journalists from diverse backgrounds coming through mainstream media? And if you look at the mainstream media in Australia, it's not diverse. It's changing. It's slowly changing, too slow. But how can we improve that? So this isn't about regulation. This is about initiatives that media organisations can take to improve the way that they do their public interest reporting and journalism. But I'm just changing hearts and minds. I mean, this is the education part of it, but simply telling people facts is not enough. This is what came up at Yoorrook. We thought so much about this, and it's not enough to say that this massacre happened and that's bad. Therefore, you understand contemporary injustice against Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and understand why rates of unemployment are higher, but there is a connection between historic disadvantage and the contemporary disadvantage. Again, it's not enough just to say that. How do you make this emotionally relatable to someone, and how do you understand the experience of a mother who loses a son in a death in custody incident?
And just on the Yoorrook Commission, you've raised a good point, because in our conversations, you talked about that moment when the Voice referendum was defeated, and obviously despair at a place like the Yoorrook Commission, people feeling like, I imagine that Australia had rejected a modest claim from Aboriginal people, but you didn't. Tell us about your immediate response, because I was struck by it. It seemed to say something about you. You didn't give way to despair. What happened?
No, I had the luxury of not being Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander, not being from that community. So I felt despair. I spoke to Auntie Eleanor that morning and said, "I'm so sorry." She, in her wisdom, has seen it all before, and she helped me process that, because she'd seen the injustice, she'd seen the steps back, she'd seen the rejection from non-Aboriginal Australia of the modest demands of First Nations communities. But more than that, for me, I looked at there were survey results about why people voted in a particular way, and there was one particular question that was asked. It wasn't directly on the referendum, and it was, do you think colonisation has been good or bad or mixed unsure for First Nations people? And I just spent, a lot of time at Yoorrook looking and reading and receiving evidence about all the impact of all the intergenerational trauma, stolen generations, child removal, criminal justice, excluded from employment, from housing, from education. And then I saw this result, and twice as many people thought colonisation had been good for First Nations people as thought it had been bad. And there was a big chunk who were mixed unsure, about 40%. And for me, that struck me. And it was like, we can make the best recommendations about reform and what needs to change, and they will not be successful until we change that understanding, until we build understanding of the impact of language and culture being suppressed, the impact of land being taken away, the deep connection Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have to country, and why, when country is healthy, they're healthy. When culture and language is thriving, their well-being is thriving. And so I was lucky. I was energized. I'm doing a job where I can do something about it. And so, I was fired up to work harder but it changed my focus. And we talked a lot about it at Yoorrook internally about should we be focusing on crafting the best possible recommendations based on the best evidence, or should we be trying to tell the truth about what has happened and how it's still happening today and what it means for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and tell it in a way that is emotionally relatable to mainstream Australia, whose upbringing or privilege, like me growing up, is removed from that. And I think that's changing. When I look at my kids and what they're learning and their understanding is far, far different from mine. So I'm optimistic that things are in the right direction. And if you read the final report from Yoorrook, this is the official public record. There's reports about reform that are very important that'll feed into the treaty process. For me, the greatest achievement is the report written by First Nations people about the history of Victoria, and I encourage all the listeners to read it, because it is it's Aboriginal people saying for the first time in an official document, it's a Royal Commission report, this is what happened, this is our perspective on what happened, and this is how we saw it through our eyes, and it's powerful and tragic.
Let's hope that gets read. We should wrap up, but let's stay on this point. I've got a strong sense of Hugh in our conversations and you say in the piece, we need to build common ground, we need to build empathy, and I feel that that's a consistent theme in your work and in your priorities. But how do you do that? How do we, in this conversation, you and me here, make that something that's not just a motherhood statement, but how do we make it something that is, because it's both potentially just anodyne and meaningless, and yet there is no other way, surely, is to find ways where we are. There's some, you directed me to a wonderful podcast by Michael Ignatieff, a Canadian political scientist, in which he talks about the challenge of human rights as recognizing people unlike us and recognizing their full humanity. Let's finish this conversation by you telling us how we best do that.
It's hard. Brian Stevenson, who's an amazing advocate from the US, talks about proximity. How do you bring people proximate to the injustice? And I believe that when people have that proximity and that the emotional connection,
marriage equality we talked about,
marriage equality. There's one particular video of someone ringing her grandmother, who's I think Christian, conservative. And she says, "Would you vote for yes for me and my lesbian partner?" And she says, "Oh, look, it's not part of my belief system, but I'll do it because I see how much you love each other, and love is the most important thing." And that emotion is critical, and that respect and that dignity. This is what the heart of human rights. It's respect, dignity, equality. It's looking out for, it's kindness, looking out for each other. And there's a client we worked with we worked with his family. He was detained on Nauru for 6 or 7 years, and his family had arrived a few weeks before him on a different boat, and so they were living in the community in Sydney with visas. And his son would hold up a Father's Day card to him across a crappy internet connection on Skype. And with Nick McKenzie from The Age, we told that story, and you can't not watch that footage and not be emotionally moved. We're human beings. We're in families. We're parents. It's deeply moving, and we were able to reunite him with his family through advocacy and things like that. So it's that connection. We have to tell the story and of the injustice of what's happening, and provide solutions as to how to fix it. And that's it. Yeah.
And you say it's hard, and it's harder than ever right now, isn't it? Because of the way our society is going, the polarization, retreat to tribes, a sense.
Social media amplifies this. It's monetized. It drives people to the extremes. And through the work that, particularly over the last year, looking at the war in the Middle East and its impact in Australia, there is a whole lot of people who are not, whose words are not being represented in the mainstream media, who have, and there is lots of scope for common ground. There is lots of scope for conversation. For these issues are hard, but there's a pathway forward.
Great to chat with you again. You've got big ambitions. I'll just say this because we're out of time, but you have an aspiration to create a
Human Rights Act for Australia.
Yeah.
And it's a missing part of our democracy. And we need to get there.
Great to chat to you again, Hugh.
Thanks,
Thank
James.
you.
That was Australian Human Rights Commission President Hugh de Kretser in conversation with freelance writer James Button for the latest Good Weekend Talks. If you enjoyed this episode, please remember to subscribe, rate and comment wherever you get your podcasts, and keep tuning in for more compelling conversations. Coming soon, Good Weekend senior writer Gay Alcorn interviews Sarah Wilson, the journalist, author, presenter, podcaster and philosopher. Good Weekend Talks is brought to you by the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age. Proud newsrooms powered by subscriptions. To support independent journalism, search Subscribe Sydney Morning Herald or The Age. This episode of Good Weekend Talks is produced by Conrad Marshall and edited by Tim Mummery, with technical assistance from Cormac Lally and Taylor Dent. Tammy Mills is our executive producer, Tom McKendrick is head of audio, and Greg Callahan is the acting editor of Good Weekend.